Hey everybody, it's Dr. White here with just a quick roundup of the solutions for the Section 1.1 DA. So if you are to look at the solutions, which I recommend strongly that you do, then in your files pane, go to the /com, then Dr. White stuff, Mat 111, old DAs, work by Dr. White. You'll find an R Markdown version and also the knitted HTML version. It will probably suffice to look at the HTML version. So you click on it and ask to view in web browser because it's a web page. And up it comes. And I'm going to make this a bit larger for you to see. Okay. So we were working with the youth risk data set, looking at the relationship between the variables sunscreen and grades. And we wanted to know if there was any association between how much you use sunscreen and your grades. So we made a little tally table to investigate the question, and here is the table. Okay. First question was how many students who never used sunscreen got mostly A's and B's? Well, looking at those who never used sunscreen and got mostly A's and B's, that is 747. Okay, next, how many students who always use sunscreen get mostly A's and B's? Looking under the always column for those who get mostly A's and B's, then we're in this cell here with 73. So the answer to that question is 73 students. And it looks like I have a typo there. That should be an always instead of a never. So I'm going to go ahead and change that typo right here, and you'll see it corrected by the time you actually watch the screencast and open those solutions for yourself. Okay, save that and knit it. Okay, and I'll pop that up and refer to that from here on out. Okay. Okay. So we had this comparison between students who always and students who never use sunscreen, people getting A's and B's. And we're supposed to say whether the following statement is true or false. Explain your answer briefly. Here's the statement you need to evaluate. Students who never use sunscreen were more likely to get mostly A's and B's than were students who always use sunscreen, because there were more students never using sunscreen and getting mostly A's and B's, 747, than students always using sunscreen and getting mostly A's and B's, only 73 of them. Well, the answer to this question is that the statement is just false. The reason that it's false is there's a lot more students who never use sunscreen, 1,188 of them, than students who always use sunscreen, 90 of them. So just by that alone, you would expect there to be more students in the never using sunscreen group who usually get A's and B's than there are over in this much smaller group of 90 people, okay? You can't really go by number comparisons alone when the group sizes differ. You really need to compare percentages. So if you really wanted to see who's more likely to get A's and B's, then you should compute the percentage of all people who never use sunscreen who get A's and B's, and that's about 68.87%. And you should compute the percentage out of all, who always use sunscreen, the percent that get A's and B's. So that's the 73 over 90 times 100 to make it a percent, and that's 81%. So actually 81% of the people who always use sunscreen get A's and B's. Only 62% of the people who never use sunscreen get A's and B's. So it seems like it's really the reverse of the way that the question suggested after you compare percentages. Okay, here's another percentage for you to compute. Find the percentage of students out of all students who never use sunscreen who get mostly D's and F's. So looking up here, out of those who never use sunscreen, how many get mostly D's and F's? That's 58. And the total is 1188. So if you were to divide 58 by 1188, sorry about that, multiply by 100 to make it a percent, then you get about 4.88%. So about 5% of students who never use sunscreen get mostly D's and F's. Similarly, to find the percent of students out of all students who always use sunscreen who get mostly D's and F's, you would look at the number out of those who always use sunscreen who get mostly D's and F's, and there was only one of them. Divide by the number who always use sunscreen. So you got 1 over 90 times 100 to make it a percent, and you get about 1.11%. Next question is to make a comparison. Based on your answers to the previous two percentage questions, who's more likely to make lower grades? A student who never uses sunscreen or a student who always uses sunscreen? So comparing the percentages, 5% versus 1%, I would say that a student who never uses sunscreen is a good bit more likely to get low grades, D's and F's, than is a student who always uses sunscreen. Looks like that student is nearly 5 times as likely, 5% versus 1%, to get low grades. Last question is about inferring causation. Would it be reasonable to conclude from this data, the 5% versus the 1%, that failing to use sunscreen actually causes your grades to be lower? Or can you find a more reasonable explanation for that relationship that we found between sunscreen use and grades? Well, my answer is this. I doubt that using sunscreen somehow makes you smarter and not using it somehow makes you dumber. Probably there's a third factor at work here. Think of a third variable about people, other than sunscreen use, other than grades, that might influence both sunscreen and grades. How about how careful a person is? People who are more careful by nature are both more likely to use sunscreen because they're told it's good for their health to do so, and they're also more likely to study hard and do homework and all that because they're careful and they're thinking ahead. And so their high carefulness kind of affects their behavior in both areas. And similarly, people who are kind of careless by nature, their behavior, both with respect to sunscreen and to grades, will similarly be affected. So I don't think it's the sunscreen use that's causing the grades to be low. It's this third factor. Okay, so that's a roundup for the DA. I will see you again soon.